Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The cold of space was an unforgiving beast, and for Captain Lasara Tetrailcore, it was an enemy she could not escape. Her ship, the Aurelia, had suffered a catastrophic engine failure during her deep space research mission, far beyond the reaches of known civilizations. Now, stranded in the vast, frozen expanse of the uncharted zone, her survival depended on one thing: her ability to maintain warmth until rescue arrived. But rescue wasn't coming. Lasara's people, the Varkar, were a hardy species from a planet that saw extreme temperature shifts, but nothing in her extensive training had prepared her for the bone-chilling cold of space. Every breath she took felt like knives against her lungs. Her fingers were stiff, her body numb. She had done everything she could to keep her systems running, used up the last of her power reserves, rationed her life support to the bare minimum, and shut down non-essential systems. Now, she was staring at the slowly blinking red emergency light, knowing her time was running out. The comms were dead, the ship's distress beacon malfunctioning. Lasara didn't even know if anyone had heard her distress call. The stars outside her cockpit window looked as cold and distant as they ever had. It was just her failing systems, and the relentless cold. She sank back in her seat, her breath visible in the freezing air. A bead of sweat rolled down her forehead, a strange anomaly in the extreme temperatures, but it only reminded her how the human body was capable of such unexpected resilience. Human physiology was fascinating, and as an explorer of foreign life, she'd studied the unique attributes of every species she encountered, including humans. They had survived on planets with conditions that would have torn other races apart. Cold, heat, radiation, humans adapted. But here she was, a species born in the harshest of climates, on the brink of freezing to death. Her eyes fluttered as the world seemed to blur. She couldn't feel her legs anymore. Every part of her body was shutting down. But in that moment, just as her consciousness was beginning to fade, she heard something. It was a faint hum at first, like the distant whir of a machine, but it grew louder. Then, there was the unmistakable sound of another ship's engines. It was impossible. There was no way anyone could have reached her out here in the middle of nowhere. But it was there. The Aurelia shook slightly as a vessel approached, its shape becoming visible through the frost-covered windows. Lasara's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Had someone actually heard her distress call? The ship appeared to be human in design, sleek and compact, but vastly more advanced than any human technology she'd encountered before. It maneuvered gracefully, positioning itself next to her ship with the expertise of a seasoned pilot. The relief that washed over her was immediate, but as she slumped in her chair, her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. A figure appeared in the doorway of her cockpit, silhouetted against the dim light. She was too exhausted to move, too weak to defend herself if necessary. But the human before her didn't look hostile. They looked concerned. "Captain Tetrailcore?" the human asked, their voice steady but laced with concern. Lasara managed to lift her head, blinking as the words barely registered. The human appeared to be a man, shorter than her by a significant margin, but his presence exuded an air of authority. His thick winter gear was covered in frost, his face partially obscured by a helmet, but his eyes shone through with a sharp intelligence. "Why, yes," she replied weakly, her voice a mere whisper. "Hold on," he said, quickly moving to her side. "You're going to be all right. Just let me get you warmed up." He didn't ask questions, didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he worked quickly, pulling her from her seat and wrapping her in a heat shield, his movements efficient and practiced. The warmth it provided was immediate and intense. Lasara gasped, her senses flooding back as warmth spread through her limbs, thawing the cold that had gripped her body. The human man didn't hesitate, lifting her effortlessly and guiding her to what appeared to be a makeshift bed in the corner of his ship's medical bay. "You're safe now," he said. "I'm Captain Jace Ward, and I've got you." Lasara's eyelids fluttered, fighting to stay open as the warmth of the blankets enveloped her. Her mind was still foggy, struggling to piece together the events. She wasn't sure how long she'd been drifting in the void, but it hadn't been long enough for her to lose all hope. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice raw. Captain Ward smiled, though there was an edge to his expression that suggested this wasn't his first rescue mission. "No need to thank me. Just focus on staying alive. I'll get you to safety." Lasara closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by exhaustion. She didn't know where he had come from or how he had found her, but she was grateful. The cold that had nearly claimed her life was beginning to recede, replaced by the warmth of a human who had not only saved her, but also sparked something inside her. A strange, new curiosity. As the warmth continued to spread through her, Lasara allowed herself to relax, her body finally surrendering to the safety and comfort that had eluded her for so long. The cold void of space had nearly killed her, but a human had brought her back to life. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of hope. Lasara's recovery came slowly, but it was steady. Over the next few hours, Captain Jace Ward kept her warm with blankets and the heating system in his ship, which hummed quietly around her. She barely spoke, focusing on regaining control over her body as the coldness in her veins melted away. Her mind, too, was sluggish, overwhelmed by the intense shock her body had endured. But each moment, as the warmth spread through her limbs, her clarity returned. She had never been one to feel vulnerable. As a Varkar captain, she had led countless missions, facing hostile planets, unfriendly species, and volatile environments. Yet here she was weak and helpless, relying entirely on a human stranger. The irony wasn't lost on her. Humans were known for their resilience, but their physical endurance was nothing like the Varkars. They were more fragile in some ways. But this man, Captain Jace Ward, had managed to save her life when all hope seemed lost. Lasara lay back in the makeshift medical bed, eyes fluttering open once more. The ship's interior was minimalist but functional. It had the feel of a vessel designed for travel rather than luxury. She could hear the quiet hum of engines and the occasional beep from what appeared to be a monitor across the room. It was a stark contrast to the cold, lifeless void she had just escaped. Jace stood near the small control panel, typing away on the console with practiced efficiency. His broad shoulders were outlined by the soft, ambient light, but there was something about his movements that hinted at a deep concentration. Despite the fact that he had saved her life, there was still something detached about him, an air of professionalism that kept him distant. But as Lasara watched him, something shifted in her mind. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice still rough from the cold, but strong enough to be heard. Jace glanced over his shoulder, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Just making sure we're on course. We're heading for a nearby station. Should be safe there. Your ship's beyond repair, unfortunately." Lasara nodded, grateful that he wasn't pressing her for details yet. The Varkar had a reputation for being proud and reserved, and sharing her mission, let alone her current failure, wasn't something she was ready to discuss with him. "Not yet. Thank you again," she said, more firmly this time, her eyes meeting his. "You didn't have to help me. I don't even know how you found me." Jace shrugged, his face softening just slightly. "I was on my way to a research mission of my own. Your distress signal pinged just as I was passing through the area. Took a chance you were still alive. Glad I did." Lasara could hear the hint of humor in his voice, though it was subtle. She hadn't expected to hear a human laugh, especially not in the midst of such a dire situation. For a moment, the space between them felt less vast. He wasn't just a human. He was someone who had taken a risk for a stranger. A strange connection, however small, had begun to form. The quiet continued, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Lasara studied the ship's interior, then her gaze drifted back to Jace. He was focused, a man who had a purpose and had made it his life's work to pursue it. There was something quietly admirable about his resolve. It wasn't that he was loud or brash, like many humans she'd encountered, but there was a silent confidence that radiated from him. She sat up gingerly, her body still weak but improving. She stretched, testing the limits of her newfound strength. "I should be able to get up soon. Thank you for the medical attention. I can manage from here." Jace looked at her with a mixture of concern and amusement. You're in no condition to be moving around. The warmth is still taking effect. Just rest. Lysara's brow furrowed, her pride flaring. I'm not a helpless child. Jace raised an eyebrow but held up his hands in mock surrender. I'm not saying you are. Just don't push it. You've been through a lot. She studied him for a long moment, not sure what to make of his casual, yet kind demeanor. It was rare that she felt so seen in the way he was looking at her. It was disorienting, and Lysara quickly turned her head, focusing on the bulkhead of the ship to avoid his gaze. In the silence, the ship's engine hummed a steady rhythm, a constant that contrasted sharply with the chaos of her recent experiences. Lysara's thoughts turned inward as she reflected on her situation. Alone, stranded in an uncharted part of space, with a human who had saved her life. I didn't expect to be rescued, she admitted, her voice softer this time. It seemed like there was no chance. Jace turned away from the control panel and moved closer to her bed. I think a lot of people would have given up. But you didn't. You're still here. Her eyes met his, the full weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, it almost felt like he was speaking to her more as a person than as a species. She had been ready to accept death. But now, she felt something stir inside her. Something like hope. But it was more than that. It seems strange, she said slowly, that you saved me. Someone like me. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze intense. Someone like you? Varkar. I'm not human. I don't belong here. Jace smiled faintly, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity. Funny thing is, I don't think I believe in belonging. Not in the way you mean. Lysara fell silent, taking in his words. They lingered in the air, shifting something deep inside her. In that moment, she realized something unsettling. She was no longer just grateful to him. She was curious about him. And maybe something more. The cold of space had nearly claimed her. But now, with Jace's warmth surrounding her, a new question stirred in her mind. What would this strange connection mean for both of them? The days blurred together as Lysara's body continued to recover. Each moment brought her closer to full strength, and though she still rested more than she would have liked, she found herself growing more accustomed to the human ship's layout. The vessel, which Jace had simply referred to as Vigil, was small, practical, and efficient. Everything a seasoned explorer would need for long journeys through unknown space. Lysara was accustomed to the grandeur of Varkar ships, sleek and elegant, their interiors built for diplomacy and combat. But Vigil was different. It was designed for survival. Jace remained by her side, always ready to help, but never overbearing. His quiet, confident nature was a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded their meeting. He didn't press her for more details about her mission or her people. It was as though he knew better than to rush her. But in his own way, he was always there, just out of reach but close enough to make her feel safe. Lysara found herself observing him more than she cared to admit. It was a subtle thing at first, a glance here and there when he wasn't looking. She couldn't help herself. Jace's movements were always purposeful, but not hurried. There was something calming about his presence, and it was difficult for Lysara to ignore how much she looked forward to seeing him each day. The cold void she had escaped no longer seemed quite so vast with him around. But still, she kept a distance. It was part of her nature, a soldier's instinct to remain emotionally detached. She couldn't allow herself to become too close to him, not when she had no idea where this connection would lead. She had to remember that, no matter how warm and kind he seemed, he was still a human, and she was still Varkar. One evening, after she had regained enough strength to move around the ship without assistance, Jace invited her to the small cockpit for a change of scenery. He seemed eager to show her something other than the sterile, utilitarian confines of the ship's medical bay and common areas. Lysara was curious but wary. "I've been meaning to show you something," he said, glancing over his shoulder at her as she entered. "A view that might help you understand why I love this job." Lysara hesitated at the doorway, the vastness of space visible through the large, curved windows of the cockpit. It was a sight she had seen countless times in her career, but somehow, with Jace beside her, it felt different, more intimate. She stepped forward, her gaze drawn to the stars outside. The expanse of space stretched before her, endless, cold, and infinite. But there was something about it now that felt less intimidating, less isolating. The way the stars glimmered like tiny embers against the black void gave her a strange sense of connection. She had always thought of space as a dangerous place, a place to be feared. But with Jace, the coldness seemed to recede. Here, between the stars, she wasn't alone anymore. Jace leaned against the console, his arms crossed. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing out one of the brighter constellations in the distance. "That's where I'm from. Or at least that's the system I grew up in. It's funny, out here in the vastness of space, everything feels small. Like we're all just tiny specks, floating around." Lasara studied the constellation he pointed to, trying to connect the dots between what she saw and the way Jace spoke. She could see the affection in his eyes as he looked out at the stars. It was the same affection she had felt when she thought of Varker's homeworld, the deep pride in one's roots. But the difference was that Jace wasn't looking at his home as a place of conflict or war. He was looking at it as a part of him, his history, his past, something he carried with him. "It's beautiful," she said softly, unsure if her words would be enough to express what she was feeling. Jace turned to face her fully, his eyes meeting hers. "I thought you might like it. Space, it's a strange thing. It can be suffocating and liberating at the same time. But there's one thing I've learned, Lasara." He took a step closer, his voice low and earnest. "The farther you go, the more you realize that we're all connected in some way. Even when it feels like we're drifting apart." Lasara's breath caught in her throat. His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within her. She had always believed in the necessity of keeping distance, of maintaining boundaries. But in the silence that stretched between them, she wondered if Jace was right. Maybe she had been wrong to compartmentalize her emotions, to view everything through the lens of duty. "I never thought much about connection," she said quietly, her voice betraying an unexpected vulnerability. "Not like this." But her gaze lingered on his face. "I think I'm starting to understand what you mean." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the ship was the only sound in the cockpit as the stars outside continued their eternal dance. Lasara felt an overwhelming urge to say more, to tell him everything, to explain who she was and why she had ended up out here in the first place. But a part of her hesitated, unsure if the timing was right. It wasn't just her pride that kept her silent. It was fear of what would happen if she allowed herself to fall into this strange, new connection. Jace didn't press her, though. He merely nodded, his gaze steady. "When you're ready, you can tell me. I'll be here." His words were a quiet promise, and for reasons she couldn't fully comprehend, Lasara found herself believing him. It wasn't the kind of promise she'd expected from a human. It was the kind of promise that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, the universe had a way of bringing people together when they needed it most. As the silence settled between them once again, Lasara's heart began to race, but not out of fear. This time it was anticipation. A new chapter was beginning, not just for her, but for both of them. And somehow, she had the feeling that the stars outside their window were only the beginning. Days turned into weeks aboard the Vigil, and though Lasara's physical recovery was nearly complete, the emotional turmoil she had pushed aside began to surface. She had allowed herself to soften in Jace's presence, but the more time they spent together, the more she felt the weight of her own solitude. The cold void that had nearly consumed her was no longer an external force. It was something inside her that she struggled to escape. The connection between her and Jace deepened, though it was not without its complexities. Their conversations had become more frequent, more personal, and each time they spoke, Lasara found herself revealing pieces of her past she had long buried. But even as she shared, there were still parts of herself she kept hidden. Stories too painful, too vulnerable to voice aloud. And there was one thing, one constant fear, that she could never escape. The reality that her mission was far from over. The longer she stayed with Jace, the more it felt as though she was running away from the duty that had brought her here. Jace seemed to sense her inner turmoil, but he never pressed her. He continued to offer support without expectation, and though Lasara had started to open up, there was still an undeniable wall between them. She wasn't sure what would happen if she let that wall fall. One evening, as they sat together in the common area of the ship, Jace broke the silence. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice low and measured. "Is everything all right?" Lasara stared out the small window, her gaze fixed on the stars that had once seemed so distant and alien. Now, they felt more like a comfort, a reminder that even in the vastness of space, she wasn't alone. But the weight of her thoughts pressed heavily against her chest. She couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She had to tell him. "I haven't been honest with you, Jace," she said quietly, turning toward him. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something raw that she could no longer hide. "There's more to why I'm out here." Jace turned his full attention to her, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no judgment in his expression, only concern and patience. He didn't rush her. He let her take her time. Lasara exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. "I was sent on a diplomatic mission. My people, the Varkar, have been negotiating with several systems for a trade alliance." But she hesitated. The weight of the words hung heavy in her throat. "Something went wrong. We encountered a hostile force in an uncharted system, and our ship was damaged. The mission was compromised. I was supposed to gather intelligence, to learn what I could about the enemy's movements, but I lost contact with my fleet. And now, I'm stranded here with no way to reach them." She could feel the tension in her body, the anxiety that crept into her chest. She had spoken the truth, but it didn't feel like enough. She had shared the reason for her mission, but not the deeper fears that plagued her. Jace leaned forward, his gaze soft but unwavering. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. I'm here for you. I've always got your back." His words were simple, but they stirred something inside her. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. But the truth was, she didn't know if she could allow herself to rely on anyone, not even Jace. "My people. They've always prided themselves on their independence," she continued, her voice distant. "We don't rely on others. We don't share our burdens. That's how we've survived." Jace didn't respond immediately, his expression unreadable as he processed her words. The silence between them stretched, and for the first time, Lasara felt exposed. She had shared her past, but it hadn't made her feel lighter. It had made her feel more burdened than ever. Then, Jace spoke, his voice soft but firm. "You're not alone anymore, and you don't have to carry this all by yourself." Lasara looked at him, her heart beating faster. There it was again, his unwavering confidence, his belief that they could face whatever came their way together. She wasn't used to this kind of support. She didn't know how to handle it. But deep down, she realized it was exactly what she needed. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Jace," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you don't understand. My mission is too important. The stakes are too high. If I fail, the consequences could be catastrophic. My people could be dragged into a war they're not prepared for. And the Federation, they're waiting for results." Jace's expression softened even further, and he reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. "I understand more than you think, Lasara. I get that you have responsibilities, but that doesn't mean you have to shoulder everything on your own. I'm here, and I'll help however I can. We'll figure this out together." Lasara's breath caught in her throat. She had heard words like this before, promises made by others, only to be broken when the going got tough. But something about Jace's sincerity made her pause. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to care this much. For the first time in a long while, Lasara felt her resolve waver. She had been so focused on her duty, so determined to keep her mission at the forefront of her mind, that she had forgotten what it meant to have someone by her side, someone who cared. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jace gave her a small, reassuring smile, the kind that felt like a promise. Unspoken but powerful nonetheless. "I mean it, Lasara. No matter what happens next, you're not facing it alone." Her eyes lingered on his face, searching for any sign of doubt. But there was none, just quiet, steadfast confidence. And in that moment, Lasara realized something she hadn't allowed herself to accept before. She was no longer alone. She had never been alone. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to keep running from the connection they had built. But as the night wore on and the stars continued their slow dance outside the ship's windows, Lasara knew that her mission wasn't over. The Varkar were still in danger. But now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she had a choice. And with Jace beside her, that choice didn't seem so impossible. The days following Lasara's confession were filled with a quiet tension. She and Jace fell into an unspoken rhythm, one that was both comforting and unsettling. The air between them was heavy with unvoiced emotions, a delicate balance of shared understanding and uncharted territory. Lasara had begun to feel a shift inside herself, something that told her that this bond with Jace wasn't just fleeting, but something that could change the course of her future. And yet, she still carried the weight of her mission. The Varkar were depending on her, and that responsibility would never fade, no matter how much her heart tugged in a different direction. The Vigil drifted through the empty void of space, its sensors constantly scanning for any signs of distress, any indication of threats. Jace had been focused on the ship's maintenance, recalibrating systems and preparing for the long journey ahead. Lasara, though she had grown stronger, still spent most of her time in the common area, reflecting on what she had told him. The Federation had been clear in their orders: find the enemy, gather intelligence, and return with information that could protect the Varkar. Failure meant war. There were no other options. But as the days passed, a new thought began to gnaw at her. What if the enemy she was meant to find wasn't what she expected? What if it was something more complex, more dangerous than she could have ever imagined? It was on the fourth day after their conversation that the feeling, the one she had been trying to ignore, became impossible to suppress. They were no longer alone in the dark. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. Lasara stood up abruptly, her eyes scanning the holoscreen as the ship's alarms suddenly blared to life. "Jace," she called, her voice sharp with urgency. "We've been detected. A ship, just outside our range." Jace appeared from the hallway, his face tense, his eyes flicking over the data streaming across the cockpit's control panel. "Can you get a read on them?" Lasara's fingers moved quickly over the interface, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "They're too far for a visual, but their signature matches nothing I've seen before. This unfamiliar." Jace's brow furrowed. "Not a pirate, then?" "Not like any pirate I've encountered. It's deliberate. They're tracking us." Jace cursed softly under his breath. "Not good. We need to get out of here. We've been sitting ducks for too long." "I'm aware." Lasara's voice was calm, but her mind was racing. She knew that this could be the enemy she was seeking, the one that had caused her ship to crash, the one that had put her mission in jeopardy. And now, here they were again on her tail. Jace didn't wait for her to finish speaking. He moved with practiced efficiency, already accessing the ship's navigation system. "I'm rerouting us toward the nearest station. If we can get there before they catch up, we'll be safe." Lasara nodded sharply, her eyes never leaving the screen. She could feel the tension between them heighten, a charged anticipation that mirrored the pulse of the ship. In this moment, there was no room for doubt, no time for hesitation. They had to act, and fast. "Engage thrusters now," she ordered. Full speed. Jace's hands flew over the controls. The ship hummed to life, its engines roaring as it lurched forward, pushing them deeper into the unknown. The stars outside the windows blurred into streaks of light, and Lasara's heart pounded in her chest as the ship accelerated. But the unknown vessel wasn't far behind. The enemy ship was relentless, keeping pace with Vigil despite their increased speed. Lasara knew they couldn't outrun them, not without risking everything. "Jace, we need to fight back," she said, her voice low but firm. "We can't outrun them, but we can defend ourselves." Jace didn't hesitate. "You're right. I'm prepping the weapons." Lasara moved swiftly toward the armory, her mind shifting into military mode. She had fought in countless skirmishes, but nothing could prepare her for the dread of facing an unknown enemy in the depths of space, alone and unprepared. As she gathered her weapons, the ship jolted under a sudden impact. A blast from the pursuing ship. The shields flickered, and the ship shuddered, the lights dimming for a brief second. Shields holding, Jace's voice came through the intercom, steady but laced with urgency. But they've got firepower. We need to act fast. Lasara tightened her grip on the weapon she had selected, an energy pulse rifle designed for close combat. She wasn't sure what kind of ship they were facing, but she knew one thing for sure. Whoever they were dangerous. She returned to the cockpit, her heart racing as she strapped herself into the co-pilot's seat. We need to engage evasive maneuvers. If they're targeting our shields, it means they're prepping for a full assault. Jace nodded and executed a series of intricate evasive maneuvers, the ship twisting and turning in sharp angles as they sped through the stars. Lasara's eyes flicked between the screens, watching as the enemy ship's silhouette grew larger in the distance. Then the moment came. The enemy ship fired again, but this time it wasn't just a warning shot. The blast hit their shields with full force, and Lasara felt the impact reverberate through the ship's frame. The lights flickered again, and a warning popped up on the display. Shields at 30%, Jace muttered, his jaw clenched. We need to disable them now, Lasara said, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. Aim for their engines. Jace didn't waste a moment. He locked onto the enemy ship's engines, firing a precision shot that ripped through the dark. The blast struck true, causing the enemy vessel to stagger, but it wasn't enough to disable them completely. The ship was still operational. Lasara's mind raced as she watched the display. There was no more time for gradual tactics. She needed to end this now, before the situation escalated beyond repair. Jace, I'll handle this, she said firmly, grabbing her pulse rifle and standing. I'll board their ship. I'll take them out from the inside. Jace looked at her with concern, but there was no time for argument. Be careful. She gave him a sharp nod. I'll be back before you know it. With her pulse rifle in hand and a deep resolve in her heart, Lasara left the cockpit and made her way to the airlock. The unknown enemy was closing in fast, but she was determined. She wasn't going to let her mission fail, not again. And she wasn't going to let Jace down. As the airlock door sealed behind her, the quiet tension of the ship gave way to the pounding of her own heartbeat. The enemy ship loomed ahead, a dark shadow against the stars. And Lasara knew that this next step, boarding their vessel, was the final test of everything she had worked for. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something greater, and she was ready. Lasara's heart hammered in her chest as the airlock sealed behind her, the low hum of the vigil fading as the hatch to the enemy ship opened. The coldness of the unknown ship's hull pressed against her, and she momentarily hesitated, taking in the eerie silence. This wasn't a ship built for comfort or diplomacy like hers. The layout was jagged, its corridors dark and narrow. Metal walls bore the scars of countless battles. This was a warship, and Lasara felt the weight of that knowledge pressing down on her as she stepped forward. Her pulse rifle was gripped tightly in her hands, her every step cautious but purposeful. Every movement of hers was calculated, honed by years of combat training. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now, when everything she had worked for was hanging by a thread. The moment she stepped into the enemy ship's main corridor, the low hum of machinery and the distant sound of footfalls echoed around her. Her eyes flicked over the shadows, her mind calculating the distance between her and the unknown threat lurking within. There was no telling how many of them there were or what they looked like. All she knew was that they were relentless, and they had followed her into this empty void. She advanced through the tight hallway, her breathing controlled, her instincts sharp. She had learned to trust them over the years, but even as she moved with precision, the weight of uncertainty gnawed at her. Then, a low metallic clang rang out from the distance, followed by voices, alien voices. Lasara froze, her senses on high alert. The voices were guttural, low in pitch, and filled with a strange foreign cadence. They didn't speak the common tongue of the Federation, but they were clearly in communication. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger of her rifle as she crouched low, moving along the walls to the junction where the voices came from. She didn't dare move too quickly. One misstep could reveal her position. As she rounded the corner, Lasara's breath caught in her throat. Before her stood three tall, imposing figures. Their armor was dark, sleek, and covered in sharp angles, designed to intimidate. Their faces were obscured by masks, their glowing eyes the only sign of life. They were unlike any species Lasara had encountered before, aggressive, and without a hint of hesitation in their movements. The leader of the group, standing slightly ahead of the others, turned toward her, its gaze locking onto hers. The other two remained motionless, waiting for a command. For a moment, nothing happened. Time seemed to slow as Lasara weighed her options. Her mind raced through tactical possibilities. She could engage them head-on, but that was dangerous. She needed to act with precision. She needed an advantage. And then it came to her. Lasara threw herself into a low roll, narrowly avoiding the blast of a weapon fired from one of the alien soldiers. The bolt whizzed past her, striking the wall and sending sparks flying in all directions. She landed in a crouch, her rifle aimed directly at the leader of the group. Before the enemy could respond, Lasara fired. The first shot hit its mark right in the chest plate. The enemy soldier staggered back, its armor sizzling with energy. But it didn't fall. Instead, the soldier raised its weapon, its glowing eyes narrowing in fury. Lasara's heart raced, but she didn't falter. She fired again, this time hitting the shoulder joint. The impact sent a shockwave through the enemy's body, throwing it off balance. She was faster now, fluid in her movements, reacting without thought. She leapt forward, closing the gap between them, and with one final shot, she disabled the leader. The two remaining soldiers hesitated for only a moment. Then they moved in unison, charging her position. Lasara pivoted, sliding against the wall for cover. Her mind was working quickly, every tactical response calculated in an instant. She fired again, aiming for the exposed joints of the soldier's armor. Each shot found its target, but the aliens were strong, and their armor was thick. Her breath quickened as she realized she couldn't take them down with conventional methods. They were too powerful, and she wasn't equipped for close combat. But she had one advantage, the environment. Lasara pushed herself off the wall, drawing the soldiers toward her with quick, erratic movements. As they neared, she ducked behind a supply crate, and with a swift motion, she triggered an emergency airlock breach on the far side of the corridor. The force of the sudden decompression caught the soldiers off guard. The vacuum of space sucked out everything within the corridor, and the aliens were thrown backward, their grip on the ground lost as they were pulled toward the breach. It wasn't perfect, but it gave Lasara the opening she needed. In a single fluid motion, she took aim and fired one final shot, knocking one of the soldiers into the breach. The other tried to react, but before it could, Lasara used her momentum to launch herself toward it, catching it in a grapple. In the moment before it could regain its balance, Lasara pressed her rifle's stock into the soldier's throat, pulling the trigger at point-blank range. The ship's pressure returned to normal as Lasara stood, chest heaving, the adrenaline still coursing through her. She surveyed the now silent corridor, her mind processing the aftermath. She had done it. The immediate threat was neutralized. But she knew there was no time to relax. More enemies would be coming. And now she had to find what she had come for. The data she needed, the information that could turn the tide for the Varkar, was on this ship. Lasara couldn't afford to waste any more time. She sprinted through the corridor, the echoes of her footsteps reverberating against the cold metal walls. Her thoughts raced, each step carrying her closer to the heart of the enemy vessel. As she approached the central control room, the door hissed open, revealing a large chamber filled with holographic displays and alien technology. It was unlike anything Lasara had ever seen before, an unsettling mix of organic and mechanical elements. And there, at the center of the room, was the data she needed, a terminal linked to a vast network of information. She moved quickly, accessing the interface with practiced ease. Her fingers flew over the keys as she downloaded the intelligence. But just as she finished, a deep voice echoed through the chamber, cold and commanding. "You think you've won?" Lasara turned to face the source of the voice. A figure stood in the doorway, a tall, cloaked figure, its face obscured by shadows. It was the leader of the enemy ship, and now it was time to face the real battle. "I don't think I've won," Lasara replied, her rifle raised, her voice steady. "But I'm about to," and as the figure stepped forward, Lasara knew that everything had led to this moment. This final confrontation would determine not only her fate, but the fate of her people. The battle for survival had just begun. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.